Hello and welcome to Chetan Bharat Learning, and in this class we're going to do current affairs for international relations from 16th of December to 21st of December, right? So there were some interesting developments and some milestones that we're going to take a good look at, all right? So what are we going to cover today? The first thing that's on our mind today is news channels across the world and major journals are taking note of the fact that it's been 10 years from the Arab Spring. So we're going to get a quick look at what happened then and what's happening now, right? And if you get quizzed on any aspect of Arab Spring, I'm going to ensure that you know what you're talking about, all right? Then we held a virtual summit with Bangladesh, and we'll take a bird's eye view of the India-Bangladesh relations, and then we're going to learn what are CAATSA sanctions that the United States has imposed on Turkey and how do we come into the picture, all right? So let's begin right away. So the first things first, it's been 10 years of Arab Spring. As the anglicized would say, it's actually just Arab Spring, all right? So what had happened was that a man named Mohammed Bouazizi had set himself ablaze in front of a government building. And why did he do so? In his own account, he said that he had been putting a fruit cart at the same spot for a very long time, and the police asked him for a permit, and in essence what he said was that they were asking for a bribe. Now when that didn't work out, because he just didn't have the money to pay a bribe, he was slapped by a policewoman, and in his quest for dignity, right, he went around town. So there's this word in Arabic language, we also have that, it's called vasta, which essentially means association. Now in Arabic you're supposed to have vastas or connections to get stuff done, right? So he didn't have any vasta with anyone, and that's why he just could not get any reprieve from his situation, and he set himself ablaze. Now this sense of hopelessness, right, this helplessness resonated with many others in his country, and they took to the streets, all right? So large-scale protests happened around the country. The regime at that time was the president was Abidin Ben Ali. He was used to localized protests, but his security forces sort of got overwhelmed by mass protests across the country, and the president had to sort of walk out of power after 23 years in power, all right? So after a month of protest, what happened was he stepped down, and into October 2011, elections took place, right? It's a solitary election in the Arab world happened, and a democratically elected president and prime minister took office, right? Sounds like a fairly good story, right? But then what happened next was like of much more significance, right? So massive protests. After then Ben Ali sort of stepped down, protests erupted in Egypt also, right? Hosni Mubarak was the reigning ruler for a very long time there. And as the protests were sort of raging across the country, the president or the regime at that time was trying to contain these protests. So what happened was that the military refused to fire on anyone asking for the removal of the president, right? So military sort of took sides, and whenever this happens, you sort of know that revolution is in the air. How? Because in Russia also, during the Russian Revolution, you'd read it in world history, the armed forces refused to fire on the people. Same happened in France, same happened in Prague in the 1960s. And when the military refuses to fire on the people, you sort of know there is something going on, right? Because during the 1930s in India, the Gorkha Rifles refused to fire in Peshawar on red shirts, right? The outfit of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. And the British got so scared they disbanded the entire regiment, the entire platoon, all right? So Mubarak had to succumb to the protests, and he ceded power to a council of military officers. And those council of military officers, although at one time it felt like they were going to take power, that council sort of organized free and fair elections, and the person who came to power in those free and fair elections was this guy, right? Mohammed Morsi of Egypt. Now, Mohammed Morsi was the leader of this group called Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood subscribes to the ideology of Islamism. So they're called Islamists. Now, it's the fine difference between Islam and Islamists is important, all right? So if you're a Muslim, you just subscribe to a particular faith, all right? But if you're an Islamist, you believe that the state should be organized along Islamic principles, right? So there should be, there's a theocratic element to being an Islamist. So Muslim Brotherhood is largely considered to be an Islamist outfit, and these Islamist outfits are spread all across the Arab world, which were contained by the reigning dictators of those times, right? So when he attained power, the Western world got nervous, right? Because this is what democracy does. It leads to leaders who do not necessarily sort of jam with Western world, right? Democracy can be a little ugly, but it's democratic. He was chosen by the people. And then what happened was, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the military general of Egypt at that time, sort of undertook a coup and replaced him. And now the regime in Egypt is sort of governed by al-Sisi, right? So what happened here? There was a dictator who was removed, and there was a democratic movement in Egypt, and now we have like military dictatorship again, right? So you can sort of see that there was a coup. Now what happened, this interesting cartoon sort of caught my eye when I was preparing this. Here it's a beautiful cartoon, the person reading a lullaby or a night book to his child, and the Egyptian people voted to give up their freedom because they voted to get Mohammed Morsi in, and Mohammed Morsi, being an Islamist, started clamping down upon people's freedoms. Famously, he started brutally abusing the rights of people, right? In the sense that comedians were asked to leave the country and all of that. And then, so the military stepped in and gave it back to them, right? So the military stepped back in. Then what's the story in Libya? A similar story, right? Uprising began in February of 2011. So you can see the dominoes falling, right? December 2010, Tunisia; January 2011, Egypt; February 2011, Libya, right? And at that time, you know, the fight between the regime and the people got so severe, and the Western world was worried about the state repressing its own people, so they enforced a no-fly zone, right? And that sort of strengthened the rebels, right? And the rebels actually just took over Tripoli, right? And this dude here, Muammar Gaddafi, was murdered, right? He was murdered on the side of a street. Now, interestingly, there's a there's a Gaddafi stadium in Lahore, if there are any cricket fans out there. He was such a giant figure of the Islamic world that he was revered all across the world, right? There are famous diatribes that he had delivered from the stage of United Nations Security Council. The standard of living in his country, in Libya, was higher than the rest of the Arab world, right? So he was actually sort of a revered person, and instantly you can see how his power was on such a shaky ground that one protest in some country triggered protests in his country, and suddenly people took over. Then what happened was civil war, right? 2014 trigger, there were some events that led to civil war in there, and more than 200,000 people have been internally displaced, and 3 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. In fact, the political situation in Libya has like multiple factions fighting for control of Tripoli right now. All right. Then similar things happened in Yemen. Extra thing here was Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There was Al-Qaeda involved in Yemen, and Al-Qaeda actually took over huge swaths of territory, right? The person who was in charge there, Abdullah Saleh, was forced out of power. And then what happened was a new regime almost got power, but then Abdullah Saleh and Houthis, right? Houthis were Shias, with the backing of Iran, sort of wanted to take Sana'a again, and there's this civil war going on with international players like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Iran, all these players involved. So there's this civil war, and in fact the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is actually one of the world's worst, right? It was so severe that the international powers forced a deal called the Stockholm Hodeida. Hodeida is a port in Yemen through which essential humanitarian supplies are sort of funneled into Yemen, all right? So there was a Hodeida truce where all sides agreed that we cannot blockade Hodeida, but that truce is still not implemented in spirit. Right? Similar situation in Syria, right? Syria fell to the dogs, right? In fact, the situation in Syria where Bashar al-Assad who took over the reins from his father, has been in power. What happened was then we had ISIL, which took over. Look at this black region here. They became so strong they took over important parts of the territory. And the red region here is where the government forces are. And then you can sort of see that the rebel strongholds are these green places. And then this is the yellowish is the Kurdish territory. The Kurds also occupied a piece of it, right? The only reason why the Syrian regime survived is because of Russian intervention, right? Because the Western powers pretty much let the Syrian regime die, right? They just left the Syrian regime. And so what you have here is a civil war. So you can sort of look at the map of the world and figure out where all the fire has spread, right, of the Arab Spring. So is there an exception? The exception, as I mentioned, the first case is the Tunisian case, right? So all the major leaders of the political parties in Tunisia got together and decided that we're not going to let the country slide into civil war or have an authoritarian dictator take control of the country, right? So what they did was there was a Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet that was established, and this quartet was so successful in its efforts to establish a democratic regime that Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to this quartet in 2015. Then they set up this thing called the Truth and Dignity Commission, which traces its ideas to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, where like more than 60,000 complaints were filed, and some of the proceedings were televised. It was basically a way of the people from the older regime saying sorry, right? So there was some healing that happened in the process, right? So it's hailed out as this great example, but still people say it's not exactly appropriate to call Tunisia a success. Why? Because politicians who were part of the regime under the older dictators' regime came back to power through elections. All right, so the same mentality is in power, and the same mentality has sort of tried to restrict the scope and expanse of the Truth and Dignity Commission. All right, the economy is actually in tatters. The Tunisian economy has been suffering a lot. And the security situation in some of these areas, for example, the areas bordering Libya and all, is pretty bad. All right, so you can't call Tunisia also a success, right? So did the Arab Spring fail? Let's work on assumption one that it did. All right, so let's figure out what are the reasons, considering that we've assumed that it has failed. All right, the first and foremost is an idea from political theory. All right, what's the idea? Democratic states cannot establish themselves unless there is a preceding democratization of society. All right, so first you have democratic egalitarian values infused in a society, and then you can have a democratic order. It never works in reverse, except in India, right? It worked in India, right? Where the topsoil of India was not democratic, but we still have a democratic regime in our country, right? But generally, if people don't hold democratic values to be dear, there won't be a democratic regime, right? So there was no popular support for individual liberties or civil rights, right? So a democracy was never bound to succeed there. And I'm going to come to a later point as to why democracy might not have been the objective either, right? Then Islamists captured power, right? I told you what Islamists are, right? What's the central tenet of their feelings, to be honest. The central tenet of their feelings being that the state should be Islamic in nature, right? So they took power. So there's this Justice and Peace Party that has spread all over the Arab world. That took power. In Egypt, we saw a Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, okay, we'll come to that point later. Then this is the important one. There was this famous book called Why Nations Fail, and in the summary of that book, it's just institutions, right? Whenever there are weak institutions, they would not succeed. A country would not succeed, right? For example, in India, we have such strong institutions like the Supreme Court, which has a heritage of its own. We have the Election Commission. We have the Comptroller and Auditor General. We have Parliament as an institution, right? So we have these strong institutions that ensure that a country always functions within the constitutional scheme of things. Now, in these states, these dictators always kept institutions weak, except their own aura, right? So whenever an institution got prominent enough to assert its own independence, the dictators felt what? Threatened, right? Libya is a very interesting case in this regard, right? Muammar Gaddafi ruled for 40 damn years, right? 40 years, and not a single institution in Libya could rival the power or could even come close to a comparison in power with his own family, right? So they never allowed any institutions to crop up or succeed. Now, after they left, there was nothing in the name of an institutionalized structure in these countries, and so the new regimes were sort of destined for failure, were being primed for failure when they took power. All right, now the last point that you have to keep in mind as to why the Arab Spring failed is that the Western world played this dodgy little game, right? They just didn't know how to respond. Under President Obama, the responses that the United States had for much of what was going on at that time was pretty bizarre, right? They just bombed people and thought that things are going to be all right, right? They sometimes acquiesced to an extent where they just said, at some places, the stand of United States was that it's an internal matter, let's not do anything, and the bloodshed continued. In some matters, they enforced no-fly zones, for example, in Libya and Syria, and ensured that the war kept raging on and no side won, right? The United States is that familiar Hollywood character that just that wants to love but just knows only how to hate, all right? So then, like, when, for example, when in Egypt, when Fatah al-Sisi took power, when he became president, after overthrowing a democratically elected leader, United States did not say anything. In fact, John Kerry said it's not even a coup, right? It was the Secretary of State at that time. So the West also played a role in when the autocratic power sort of came back to the Arab world, all right? Now, why does this topic become so interesting? It becomes interesting because these uprisings began again in 2019, all right? And this time it was Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Sudan, right? Omar al-Bashir, who's been the president of Iran for I don't know how long, right? Everyone thought Omar al-Bashir could not be kicked out of power, and he was, right? These protests are still continuing, right? They're still continuing. So who is to say if the Arab Spring has failed, right? We don't even know if Arab Spring has ended, right? The spring has continued, right? We just don't know what will come out of it. The problem is that we sort of compare revolutions to the Russian one and the French one. Let's sort of tone down our standards, and we'll realize that all the revolutions that have actually had effect have taken time to yield results. For example, the Prague Revolution, right? Or regular revolutions like the Green Revolution, all of that, right? They take time. And then if we only want to judge the success of the Arab Spring by measuring how democratic it is, that's a bad idea. Now, why is that a bad idea? Because dignity was the demand in Tunisia, and dignity was the demand all across these countries also. Even after the regime sort of change happened, these people continued protesting. Why? Because dignity was the case. Now, they might not have gotten that dignity, but democracy was never the idea, all right? Democracy was something that was imposed by the Western media as the goal of the movement. Well, the movement did not know, like, what's going to be done, right? So you can see sort of these four countries, and interestingly, the 2019 uprisings have now forced out as many leaders as the 2011 uprisings did, right? In the uprisings in Iraq almost forced out the prime minister of Iraq, right? In Lebanon, there's a new regime in power. So let's synthesize, right? If you get a question on the Arab Spring, what are going to be your pillars, right? First and foremost, it was a quest for dignity, all right, not for democracy. And democracy was a goal that was imposed by the Western media, right? A person who's been slapped by a policewoman suddenly is going around town using whatever vastas he have. What's his quest? His quest is not to ensure that there is a democratic regime in place, right? For example, in Tunisia, where there is a democratic regime in place, the protests continue, right? There are daily protests there happening, right? Iraq is nominally a democracy. Protests are happening there, right? So dignity was the idea. Now, the most important thing that I want you to consider is that the socio-economic conditions that led to the Arab Spring in the first place have not improved, right? They've actually gotten worse. Why? Because in 2011, when Arab Spring sort of became this big thing, oil was at its peak, right? Oil prices were high and states were getting this revenue which they were sort of transferring to their people also. Commodity was in its higher cycle, right? So commodity prices, agricultural goods were selling at a higher rate, right? So these regions were flushed to an extent with prosperity at that time. Now the situation is worse. Oil has like sunk to the ground, and commodities are also fairly cheap. So farmers in these regions are not getting the prices that they want, right? So the socio-economic conditions haven't improved, and the fear barrier was broken, right? For 40 years, these Arab countries were these great golden cages, right? Where people could not move out or no one can get in, right? So the fear barrier was broken. Now these people are emboldened with new ideas, right? So if you think of the European history in the 1900s, in the 1800s and the 1900s, right? So socialist revolution happened in the 1840, but was brutally put down. But that same socialist revolution bore fruit in the 1860s, where governments across Europe accepted socialistic designs, right? So these revolutions always take time, 30 years a minimum, and this Arab Spring is still a continuing thesis, all right? Then, so I want you to sort of end on this note that to call Arab Spring a failure would be a result of historical amnesia, right? It's just not understanding how history works. So the verdict is still out. We don't know, but the very fact that we know what's happening and we can place it in a historical context sort of lends your examiner this view that you are an educated person, right? You're a smart individual, all right? So then let's come to India-Bangladesh relations, right? So we held a virtual summit recently. The thing that I want to impress upon you right away, just hang on for a minute. Let's come to India-Bangladesh relations, right? We held a virtual summit recently. The thing that I want to impress upon you about India-Bangladesh relations is that a detailed lecture would be conducted within your international relations course, all right? So the structural issues of India-Bangladesh relations will be covered there. Right here, I'm going to try and give you a context in which to look at these relations. But for now, the focus is going to be the current driving forces in India-Bangladesh relations, all right? So why is this in news? Because we held a virtual summit with fairly comprehensive discussions on all aspects of bilateral relations. Now, this seems fairly routine, right? Whenever there is a summit with another country, it feels like it's the same boilerplate language that keeps coming out. However, you would be remiss if you did not understand the importance of this particular summit, all right? And you only get the importance if you sort of look at the relation in a historical perspective, all right? So we're going to do that. So, just to give you a brief look, in 1971, India provided the decisive turning point in the 1971 war that granted, we pretty much helped Bangladeshis earn their independence, right? So, it's always there. We've always been part of their national imagination as that helping hand, right? So, that helped, but it helped only until 1975, right? When what happened was that Zia-ur-Rahman came to power in a coup and Mujeeb Rahman was assassinated. Now, before this happened, we'd already signed a treaty that was called the Indo-Bangladesh Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Peace Relations, famously called the Indira-Mujeeb Treaty. Now, despite this treaty, when Zia-ur-Rahman came to power in 1975, the relations between both the countries plummeted, all right, because in his imagination, India was this hegemon in the neighborhood that needs to be contained, all right. Then General Irshad came to power, who ruled till 1990. In fact, SAARC, right, the South Asian Association, it was his idea. And again, the imagination was that India is this hegemonic entity right in the center of South Asia, and all the countries surrounding India need to get together to have an equitable distribution of attention and resources and negotiations, all right? So that was the idea. And driving from the same military mentality, we have this party called the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, all right, which ruled from 1992 to 1996, and Khalid Zia made it an electoral plank that she will stand up to India, right? This was her electoral plank. So the relations were always this sort of bad, right? But then what happened is Sheikh Hasina of the Awami League, right? She came to power, right, in the late 1990s, and she has been in power all the way since now, up till now, with small breaks in the middle, right? So our relations have improved, right? So when Sheikh Hasina came to India in 2010 and Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister, we made this great declaration that now is the time that we're going to move forward and have a very consolidated relationship. And that joint communication remains the fundamental building block of India-Bangladesh relations. Now, if there was a commitment in 2010 that we're going to have great relations, Narendra Modi, the Honorable Prime Minister, has sort of enriched or has facilitated the implementation of that commitment, right? How? I'm going to tell you. But before that, just note this, right? In 2014, 70% of the Bangladeshis expressed a favorable opinion of India. Now, this was the Pew poll, right? It was a survey conducted in Bangladesh. Now, how has the current regime sort of enabled this? We're going to read about the current agreements that have happened, right? 7 big announcements, right? 7 big areas in which agreements were done, right? So we get to that in a bit, but first in the structural domain, let's understand what are India's objectives. All right, so whenever you write an answer on India-Bangladesh relations, take account of these objectives and write your answers along these planks, right? So the first is connectivity, right? If you look at this picture here, Bangladesh is this giant puzzle-sized vacancy in our connectivity with Northeast, right? So there's this chickens corridor through which we send our troops, men and material to Northeast, and that has always been a strategic vulnerability that India has had. And Bangladesh sort of, if we could move our men, material and goods through Bangladesh, that vulnerability could be reduced to an extent, all right? So that is the idea, and that's how if we could ensure this movement, our strategic vulnerabilities could be reduced, right? So that's why connectivity is the mantra of India-Bangladesh relations and has been for a very long time, right? So along the road, on the road, we have this BBIN agreement where Bangladesh, Bhutan, India and Nepal are signatories. In 2017, Bhutan sort of walked out. The reasons are not important for this lecture, but Bhutan walked out. But still, at this summit, we have sort of committed that we're going to enforce enforce the agreement in its entirety. All right. The second big giant concern that India has is that Bangladesh should not turn into a hub of anti-India activities, right? That is a big concern, and including terrorism and insurgencies, right? And the third big concern that we have is China, right? China is this big element in India-Bangladesh relations. So we are worried that China could use this giant, this enormous shoreline that Bangladesh has to put pressure on India, right? So that's another concern. And then illegal migration, right? Citizenship Amendment Act 2019, the big dispute or the protest that sort of engulfed the national conversation at the time. It was actually pretty important in Bangladesh also, right? But general people in Bangladesh knew of the acts and its provisions and were constantly keeping a track of what the Indian government was going to do or was doing, right? So it was this sort of it wasn't a great time for India-Bangladesh relations, which were tokenized by a last-minute refusal of the Bangladeshi foreign minister to visit India, right? So these are the 4 aims of India's foreign policy towards Bangladesh. Now, what does Bangladesh want? The first thing it wants is water, right? It doesn't want India to restrict the water, especially from Teesta, all right? Then it wants to maintain an independent foreign policy, right? Whenever you listen to Bangladeshi diplomats, or you read their literature, there's always this concern for sovereignty, as we've had for a very long time, right? So whenever a big foreign policy decision is taken, there's always this question, was it done under Indian pressure, right? So they want to maintain their independence they want to have an independent foreign policy, essentially, all right? Then they want an easy access to the Indian market, and there is an adverse trade balance for Bangladesh when we trade with them, right? So they want a fixture for that also, right? So they import 10 times more Indian goods than they export to India, right? So these are their foreign policy goals, all right? So what happened in the summit? Think of the areas of cooperation, right? Hydrocarbons, elephant conservation, right? So elephant conservation is this really nice little cooperation that we're doing with Bangladesh, right? So it turns out that elephants don't really recognize the borders between 2 countries, right? So they don't really stop at the border and go, now we're entering Bangladeshi territory. They just move on, right? So we needed to conserve our elephants because they are in India and in Bangladesh at different times, right? So we created these conservation corridors for elephants. It's a nice little token cooperation that we've done. Then sanitation, agriculture and restoration of rail links. Now the thing that you need to understand is that before 1947, there were no borders in the east, right, eastern India. So there was this continuous movement of people subsided by some protected zones that government of the British India had created. However, that region had one of the highest per capita incomes in South Asia, and that was sort of restricted by these artificial borders that were created, right? So India wants to restore links, right? So there is a railway link that we are recreating now, we're restoring now, which had stopped functioning during the 1965 war. All right, so we want to recreate the conditions of connectivity that existed before. Then the second thing we told the Bangladeshis is that if we have vaccines being manufactured in India, you will get access to those vaccines. All right, then we sort of said that the Kushiara River, which is the Barak River in India, the Kushiara River forms the border between India and Bangladesh for a certain duration, for a certain territory, and we said that is we are going to initiate proceedings to ensure that becomes the border also, right? It wasn't clear earlier. Then Bangladesh in media has always had this complaint that a lot of Bangladeshi people die at the hands of India's border security force, right? So 250 people daily, right? Annually, right? Annually they die in scuffles, right? So they wanted like a response from India on that. So we've agreed to sort of to strengthen the coordinated border management plan that we've come up with Bangladesh, right? And then Bangladesh thanked us for the quota-free access that we've been giving to Bangladesh since 2011 under SAFTA, right? We've covered SAFTA before, all right? And then we spoke that we are going to finally get into some sort of a trade agreement with Bangladesh. Even though there is some duty-free movement of goods between India and Bangladesh, there is a negative list and all of that. So we want a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, right? A free trade deal. And both the leaders sort of said, let's work towards that. So we can see that the cooperation is taking shape, right? Like, so Manmohan Singh and Sheikh Hasina pretty much said, let's build a new future, and we can see that under the current dispensation that future is taking shape. All right, so the last big thing that I want to really impose upon you is that there is an Act East policy in India, right? We are looking towards the east to we're making those relationships better, right? There was a Look East policy all the way from Narasimha Rao, and that has turned into Act East policy now. Bangladesh wants a piece of that, right? Bangladesh wants India to take Bangladesh in its worldview when it makes these contracts for Act East policy. For example, the highway, the India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway, Bangladesh wants a link there too, right? And generally there's a proposition that Bangladesh wants to be part of the India's Act East policy, all right? Then Bangladesh sort of pushed India that we should finally get some water out of the Teesta agreement, right? The agreement has been postponed or has been sort of kept aside because of the reservations held by the Chief Minister of West Bengal, right? So then we sort of, and this is an interesting shift that we've had. So when the Rohingya crisis started appearing on the world stage as this grave crisis that it is, we always sided with Myanmar, right? We kept saying that it's an internal issue, let them deal with it. It's an internal issue, let them deal with it. But now, more recently, we have been crediting Bangladesh more often for being generous in its donations and in its relocation efforts for Rohingyas that have been done by the Bangladeshi government, right? So even though we had to do this delicate balancing act, we've been siding with Bangladesh a little more than Myanmar, right? So then we sort of, so what's happening now is that Bangladesh just celebrated its 49th victory day, right? 16th of December or so, right? And Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's 100th birth anniversary is coming, right? Then it was also Bangladesh's 49th, and next year it's going to be 50th Independence Day for Bangladesh. And then we're also going to have 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. So there's a lot of these symbolic moments turning up at the same time. So we've decided to coordinate our efforts to commemorate these people and events, and that's why we've been releasing stamps and they've been releasing stamps. Just read it, but that's not the important part here. So right, so I've been telling you what are going to be the pillars. The first pillar is going to be the connectivity, all right? Your answer must bring out this element of connectivity. Right, the current rail link is Chilahati Haldibadi. It's a very important rail link. It's one of the 6 rail links that we have decided that we're going to restore. 4 are already done. The second 2 are left. All right. Then coastal shipping, we've already agreed into an agreement with Bangladesh to allow the use of Mongla and Chittagong ports for our use through the multimodal transport way, right? Look it up. It's an important read that you must do, all right? And then we've sort of signed that BBIN agreement that I've mentioned before, and we've operationalized an air bubble arrangement between India and Bangladesh for civil aviation. So connectivity is always on the minds of bureaucrats on both sides whenever it comes to India-Bangladesh relations. Then on the economic front, right, just recognize how important Bangladesh and India are for each other, right? Bangladesh is India's biggest economic partner in the region, right? India exports like some $10 billion to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh exports $1 billion to India. And because of this adverse trade imbalance, that Bangladesh has requested India to sort of do something about it, and we have been extending credit lines, right, to ensure that that adverse trade balance is somehow taken care of or is offsetted. All right. So Bangladesh is currently importing 1,160 megawatts of power from India. So power diplomacy is another big factor. We export a lot of power, and this particular power is charging up Bangladesh's industries, right? So it's an important aspect. Then we extend a lot of development assistance to Bangladesh. In fact, 25% of our development assistance abroad actually goes to Bangladesh. It's a huge chunk, like $800 million worth of like 3 credit lines worth that, and now more credit lines will be added. And then, interestingly, Sheikh Hasina in her address pointed out to these small development projects that India was conducted at a very local level across Bangladesh, and how those were coming to fruition and were adding to the capability of the Bangladeshi people in general. Right? So these are called small development projects, and you could write in your answer that small development projects were sort of were celebrated by Bangladesh's Prime Minister. The big factor in our relationship obviously is China, right? China is Bangladesh's largest trading partner, not us. All right. China has flooded Bangladesh with foreign direct investment, right? And the goodies are just innumerable, right? For example, Bangladesh, 97% of Bangladesh's products go into, they come to around 8,000 products, go into China duty free, right? And like Bangladesh recorded its highest ever FDI in 2018. 1/3 of that was from China. All right. Then under the Belt and Road Initiative, China has committed to $31 billion of investment, second only to Pakistan, where it is investing $62 billion. All right. And Bangladesh is like it's the biggest export destination for China, right? In its arms sales, right? From 2010, it has spent almost $2.6 billion billion dollars on Chinese military hardware. In 2016-17, Bangladesh inked this agreement to buy 2 giant submarines from China, which raised certain flags. And then China is helping Bangladesh develop some of its port facilities, which again India does not feel very comfortable with, right? So if you have to take away something from this relationship, the first thing that you must take away is that Bangladesh is growing. Right? Its GDP per capita is actually higher than India's, and it's actually going to be an economic powerhouse. So we should get used to the fact, and we should use this opportunity to fuel our own industries, right? To gain market access in Bangladesh, right? Or they will export to us, we will export to them. We could both grow together. Now, this new reality, as soon as it sinks in, we can actually cooperate with each other more, right? So by 2024, it is expected that Bangladesh would graduate from a least developed country in LDC to a middle income country, all right? Then a regular interaction is going to help, right? We can't meet them once in 5 years, because what happens is whenever there are high level summits, right, the prime ministers or senior level democratically elected people's level representatives, when they meet, they sort of ask their subordinates, right, what's the status of our relationship, what's happening, right? And whenever they do this, it becomes an important event, right? So that should happen more and more, over and over again, right? For example, the European leaders keep meeting each other like every month or so, right? So we should also increase our engagement with Bangladesh. Regular interactions, right? Connectivity will be a force multiplier. I cannot belabor the point. I cannot thrust upon this point more. Your answer also needs to be sort of built around connectivity. And we shouldn't really worry as much as we do about China, because like 4,000 kilometers of borders we share with Bangladesh, right? We surround them, right? And they're our friends, right? China cannot invest any amount of money and sort of detach Bangladesh's territory from India, right? So Bangladesh will be structurally dependent on India for certain things, and we should restrict our insecurities with that regard, right? So the next topic and the last topic for the day that we're going to do is CAATSA sanctions. Now, what these sanctions are, and why are they in news, right? So the United States imposed sanctions on Turkey in response to its acquisitions of S-400 anti-aircraft missile system from Russia's defense export agency. In science and tech, your S-400 systems are going to be done properly, but I would really encourage you to go out and read about these systems. They're just mind-blowing, right? They're like just generations ahead of the American counterparts, the Patriots and the THAAD system, right? So these sanctions were imposed under Section 231 of the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA. That's the legislation, all right? So how do they work? The Congress has passed a law, and the executive wing, the United States Department of State, measures each request on a case-by-case basis, and it's sort of there's this very important phrase here, significant transaction. So whenever there's a significant transaction that they can identify with Russia or Iran or North Korea, they sort of place sanctions upon the transacting parties. All right. These are just important factors of determination that you don't need to take out. Now, what you have to do is sort of look at this communique. All right, this communique, and this is from the State Department website, which they put out right after they announced their sections, which was followed by a press release or a press conference. Sorry, right. So it says, pursuant to Section 231 of the CAATSA, on Turkey for knowingly engaging in a significant transaction with this Russia's main arms exporter entity by procuring the S-400 surface-to-air missile system. Now, it says today's action sends a clear signal that United States will fully implement CAATSA sections 231 and will not tolerate significant transactions with Russia's defense and intelligence sectors. That is the important bit. It wants to send a clear signal to others, right? So what is that signal and to whom that is? We're going to come to that in the later part, but for now, these sanctions, right? These sanctions are in place, but let's start with its impact on Turkey, all right? So these sanctions comprise a ban on, so it basically impinges on their ability to take loans for procurement of weapons and all of that. Now, last year, Turkey was sort of removed from their F-35 program, right? The 5th generation advanced aircraft that United States has, F-35. All the NATO countries are part of that program. Turkey was sort of removed from that program because at that time, Turkey had taken a decision to import S-400 missiles from Russia. Now, what are they worried about? What are the Americans worried about? They're worried about the fact that if the F-35, the structure, right, the platform is integrated with the S-400 platform, then the F-35 structure would become vulnerable to cyber attacks from the Russians, right? And we know that there was a recent cyber attack also. So that's what they're worried about. All right, and then Turkey sort of refused to buy alternative NATO systems, right? The Patriot missiles and so, right? And again, the Americans have sort of pointed out that the target for these sanctions is not these countries like Turkey and all of them, but Russia, right? So they said CAATSA is designed to impose costs on Russia, right? So what they want is that they want Russia to be denied resources, right? They don't want Russia to have money from their sales purchases because they're going to use it to further their malign activities worldwide in the US view, right? The US also wants to deny to Russia the Turkish armed forces industry, right? So what is going to be the impact on India? Now, in October 2018, we've already signed a deal with Russia to procure these S-400 missiles because it's strategically crucial for India, right? The military experts in India believe that has been the missing piece in India's strategic existence, right? So if that has been the missing piece, we really want it, and we've already done a deal in October 2000, and we've even paid the first tranche, like we've even paid them the first installment, right? And it's $800 million. Now India is expecting deliveries to begin like early next year, and the deliveries would get over by 2025, right? The only ray of hope, because we are also expecting, and you remember that signal, right? A signal to other countries, right? That signal was to us. The only ray of hope here is that the American spokesperson said that they can understand some legacy issues. Now, what do they mean by legacy issues, right? We've always been dependent on Russian systems for our defense, right? We've always been importing Russian goods and Russia's missiles and all of that. So they said there is a legacy issue. We've been dependent, so we can understand that. However, they have not said it in as many words, right? They've just said they can understand the legacy issues. So we don't really know, right, if the legacy issue would be enough or not, right? And then they said there is no blanket waiver because neither the US Congress, this is what the spokesperson said, neither the US Congress nor the executive branch of the government can apply the waiver, which is what some countries have sought, he added, right? Some country, here he is talking about India, right? We asked for a blanket waiver, which is what it seems, right? We must have asked for a blanket waiver, and they're saying we can't really give blanket waivers, right? So we're in this little dilemma, right? Whether to procure or not to procure, right? So what's the strategic issue here, right? There must be some structural element to this dilemma, right? And that structural element is that there are two big giant powers, and we are friends to both those powers, and those two powers are increasingly getting in conflict with each other. Those two powers are United States and Russia, right? After the recent cyber attacks that are like that the United States is accusing Russia for, the things are actually going to get much tougher for India, right? Because we need to walk a tightrope, and it's going to get difficult. Then there's a sovereignty element to it, right? We've already announced, right? We've already told everyone that we need this weapon, we're going to buy this weapon. Now, if we back out from buying this weapon, considering the overwhelming pressure that we're facing from United States, everyone's going to say India is not an independent entity anymore. But I guess this was the same pressure that was acting on Turkey also, right? Because Turkey has already decided. However, in Turkey's case, it was a little odd because they are a NATO alliance. They're in NATO, right? So they didn't have a legacy issue, right? They could always have gotten American missile systems or defense systems, right? But we are a legacy issue, right? We have been dependent on Soviet arms and ammunition for a very long time. So we need to do this balance, but even within that balance, our sovereignty comes to the picture. Now that we've announced to the world that we are a sovereign nation and we're doing this purchase, we can't back out of it, right? So there's that issue, and we sort of need to assert our sovereignty also. And this delicate balancing is going to be the pillar of your answer when you're writing about strategic arms sales, specifically S-400s, all right? So I guess you've gotten a good understanding of all these three topics. I hope you're continuously reading your newspapers, because that's the most important part of your preparation. And thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.